This is the Commodities Institute podcast. I'm your host, Emily Costa, and today is Monday, April 20th, 2026. Glad to have you back. We're going to begin today in the oil market because, once again, everything else in commodities is being pulled into its orbit. The fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran is already showing signs of strain, and the implications are immediate. Over the weekend, U.S. forces seized an Iranian cargo vessel attempting to breach the blockade, triggering fresh threats of retaliation from Tehran. At the center of this escalation is the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point that normally handles roughly 1/5 of global oil and gas flows. Right now, flows through that corridor remain severely constrained. Since the conflict began in late February, an estimated 13 million barrels per day of crude supply and roughly 300 million cubic meters per day of liquefied natural gas have effectively been trapped inside the Gulf. Even with intermittent reopenings, traffic has been inconsistent and confidence in safe passage remains extremely low. And here's the key point markets are now grappling with. Even if a lasting ceasefire holds, the system doesn't simply snap back. There are around 260 loaded tankers sitting idle inside the Gulf, carrying roughly 170 million barrels of oil. Clearing that backlog alone will take weeks. Rebalancing the global tanker fleet could take months. Meanwhile, upstream production is not just waiting to resume. Some fields can restart within weeks, but others, particularly those with damaged infrastructure or reduced reservoir pressure, could take months or longer. In Qatar, damage to a major LNG hub has already taken out a significant portion of export capacity, with repairs potentially stretching into years. So what you're looking at is not just a supply shock, but a prolonged recovery curve. That's why, even with occasional price pullbacks, the structural risk premium in oil remains firmly in place. And that pressure is feeding directly into downstream markets, most notably fuels. Gasoline prices are currently sitting above $4 per gallon. And while officials suggest prices may have peaked, expectations are now shifting toward a slower normalization. Sub-$3 gasoline is no longer a near-term assumption. It's a conditional outcome tied to geopolitical resolution. Now, from energy, let's move into agriculture, where the same disruption is creating a very different kind of stress. Fertilizer markets are tightening rapidly, and the driver is once again the Strait of Hormuz. More than 30% of global nitrogen fertilizer exports have been disrupted by the conflict, and prices are responding accordingly. In Argentina, urea prices have nearly doubled in the span of just over a month, rising from around $500 per ton to roughly $1,000. That's forcing farmers into difficult decisions ahead of the wheat planting season. Some are considering reducing fertilizer application, which directly impacts yields. Others are abandoning wheat altogether in favor of less input-intensive crops. This is where second-order effects become critical. Lower fertilizer usage today doesn't just affect current planting, it sets up potential yield shortfalls months down the line. And that introduces upside risk to global grain prices, even in an environment where demand has been relatively soft. At the same time, there's a paradox emerging in the United States. Domestic fertilizer prices remain significantly lower than global benchmarks by roughly $170 per ton in some cases. That price gap is creating arbitrage opportunities, with imported fertilizer being redirected out of the US to higher-priced international markets. So you have a situation where global supply is tightening, prices are rising, and yet product is still leaving one of the world's largest agricultural producers during peak planting season. That's not a stable equilibrium. It's a sign of market distortion under stress. Now, that same fertilizer dynamic brings us directly into metals, because the linkage here is sulfur. Sulfur, a byproduct of oil and gas production, is a critical input for both fertilizer production and certain metal extraction processes, particularly in copper and nickel. And right now, sulfur supply is effectively constrained due to disruptions in the Gulf. The result is a classic resource competition. Agriculture consumes roughly 2/3 of global sulfur supply, and in a tightening environment, it gets priority. That leaves metals producers exposed. In copper, about 1/5 of global production relies on sulfuric acid in solvent extraction processes. Countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Chile are particularly vulnerable. As sulfur prices rise, operating costs increase, and producers begin to scale back usage or delay processing. In nickel, the impact is even more immediate. Indonesia, the world's largest producer, depends heavily on imported sulfur for its high-pressure acid leach operations. With supply constrained and prices rising, some producers have already begun cutting run rates. The cost impact is significant. Sulfur price increases have added several $1,000s per ton to nickel production costs, pushing prices higher and tightening margins across the supply chain. So what you're seeing is a cascading effect. Energy disruption constrains sulfur, sulfur constrains fertilizer and metals, and those constraints feed back into food and industrial markets simultaneously. Now, shifting to dry freight, because logistics is the connective tissue holding all of this together, and right now it's under pressure from multiple directions. The disruption in the Strait of Hormuz has forced a reconfiguration of trade flows. One notable example is Russia increasing grain shipments to Iran via the Caspian Sea, a route that had been largely dormant for years. In the first quarter alone, shipments through this corridor surged, highlighting how quickly trade adapts when traditional routes become unreliable. At the same time, global tanker availability is being stretched. Vessels that would normally service the Middle East are tied up in longer-haul routes, particularly from the Americas to Asia. That's increasing freight rates and adding delays across the system. Even when physical supply exists, moving it efficiently is becoming more difficult and more expensive. And finally, in carbon and power markets, the focus remains on infrastructure vulnerability. The conflict has already raised the prospect of targeted strikes on power generation and desalination facilities across the Gulf. That introduces not just regional risk, but systemic risk to energy-intensive industries. Because modern commodity systems are deeply interconnected, power disruptions affect refining. Refining affects fuel supply affects transportation and agriculture, and the cycle continues. So stepping back, the key takeaway today is this. The market is no longer reacting to isolated events. It's reacting to a network of constraints. Oil is the trigger, but the impact is broadening into fertilizers, into metals, into freight, and into food systems. And even in a best-case scenario where the ceasefire holds and the negotiations resume, the recovery process is likely to be uneven and prolonged. That's the reality markets are starting to price in. If you found this episode valuable, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Find us online at commoditiesinstitute.com.